My name is Charleton Lewis. I'm an adjunct faculty member here at the University of Texas School of Architecture. This is that the Austin Skyline has seemed to be predicated more on, particularly, I would probably say, there's in that 20 years, there was a span of neglect and abandonment, and just there was not any sort of catalytic energy going on. And then when something would happen, it was typically an office building, probably on the front side of that 20-year period. But in the last 10 years or so, most of, if not all of that growth has been predicated by a need for, in a city's sort of desire to have more for housing downtown. The one thing that you don't see over the last 10 years is a significant amount of office space being developed uniformly, like most city skylines have. To be aesthetically, it was no great shakes, and there is a sort of idea that buildings that make statements, tall buildings, which we're seeing now, much taller. But again, this building stock before, in the 80s, sort of early 90s, it was really nothing to be anything that you would really sort of go, hey, check out our skyline, in both in stature but also just in aesthetically. Now you see much more diversity. You see, I think you also see architects coming in from other locations that might not have been here before. And so buildings that have some significance to them are showing up on the skyline. So there are sources of pride in that regard. As campus, that all of that growth, the height that is prevalent in West Campus, or becoming more prevalent, is something that's unique to the last probably 4 or 5 years, since the zoning changes happened over there to allow more greater density. So that's being quite impactful on the skyline overall. So, the vision of the skyline, in some aspects, has gone from being more of a central commodity to something that's much more expansive in terms of, the height and the city's understanding of height. And so I think when you look at all of that, you have to sort of acknowledge that the city has become a little bit more, in a certain sense, sophisticated in understanding how tall buildings work and how a city can grow in that regard, and being a little bit more forward thinking. There's a tower that's downtown, for instance, the Spring Tower, that has a pretty unique fire safety system in terms of egress, in terms of how you get out of the building, but it's a very, very small footprint, and that's something that was not allowed several years ago in the city. The architects came in and said, look, this is what we do in Vancouver or Canada, and it's allowed, and this is why it works. And so the city has matured, both in physically, aesthetically, but also in terms of the bureaucracy, in terms of how to deal with a city that's growing and becoming like this major city. Aesthetically, I think there's some positives in terms of just the fact that it's not sort of bland. At this point, there is some variety in the skyline. There's some very handsome structures that have been designed and built in the last 4 or 5 years. Hopefully that trend will continue. You look at the emerging projects map, and it looks like there's a lot of projects that could come online. Whether they all come online or not, I think is probably a bit too optimistic to think, but some of them actually have some really interesting things to say about design. And so if they come online, I think it just gets better and better.